Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'll be reviewing Rosario, a 2025 American horror film directed by Felipe Vargas in his feature film directorial debut. The film stars Imrad Tubia, David Dastmalchian, Jose Zuniga, Diana Lean, and Paul Ben Victor. The film follows the story of Rosario Fuentes, a Wall Street stockbroker whose estranged grandmother passes away, unleashing a demonic curse as Rosario stays with the body at her grandmother's apartment during a snowstorm. The film deals with Palo Mayombe, an Afro-Cuban religion that fuses the traditional Congo religion from Central Africa with Catholicism and Spiritism. It was released on May 2nd, 2025, and it has been met with mixed to negative reviews, with critics giving it a slightly more positive reception than audiences. The film made a little over $1 million at the box office in its short-lived run before its digital release on May 21st, 2025. With this context laid out, let's explore my thoughts on the film. Let's review Rosario. I want to start with the positives for this movie because there are some, and I think it's important to detail it. And so I'll start with the idea of the plot. The basic premise of the film, I think, is interesting, and it deals with some really interesting themes that could have been tackled in a really good horror movie. So, for example, the discussion of identity and of being an identity of an immigrant and the sort of cultural sort of stuff that goes on with that is really interesting. This film sort of delves into that and obviously has a point of view and has things it wants to say, which I think is important for any horror movie, is that the person who's making it is passionate about the material, and you can clearly tell that the creator is passionate about this material and thinks that the story is important, which I love. So that's already a positive, that Felipe Vargas is clearly connected to this film, connected to the story, clearly has a point of view, which makes horror films so much more interesting than the sort of cookie-cutter ones that a lot of filmmakers make that are just doing it to move into a bigger sort of movie or a bigger opportunity in Hollywood. You can tell that Felipe Vargas actually does believe that his story is important and that this film can do something or say something important, which is cool. And I think that this also blends in well with the use of a different sort of spirituality and religion that has some familiar elements, but also really ties into that core question of identity. So there's a lot of interesting things going on there, and it does allow for at least some more unique opportunities within the religious horror realm, which has become very stale and repetitive, and usually is very indebted to a sort of Western European Catholicism or maybe evangelical Christianity. Instead, there is elements obviously of Catholicism within that Palo Mayombe, but it also it is infused with Afro-Cubanism and Spiritism and all these different things, which makes it a little bit more interesting and a little bit more unique. Now, that being said, it doesn't necessarily do that much with it, but we'll get into that a little bit later. I also wanted to praise some of the cinematography and the use of color and lighting, which I thought was really interesting at points. You really do feel this apartment building is this rundown place, and the snowstorm feels like it's real, and there's a lot of weight to everything that's going on that makes you feel like she has to stay there, which is interesting. And in general, it felt sort of infused with a lot of color and creativity within the lighting and the cinematography department, which I really love. Of course, I'm a huge fan of Italian horror films, and it wasn't necessarily to that level, but there was a little dash of it, which really helps the film a lot, because a lot of horror films go for a very kind of default and generic look, but this one was trying something different, which I really do appreciate, even if it's not always completely effective in its execution. I also think the acting for the most part was pretty good. They had some really big name actors as well in it, so that was a plus, and I think in general all the actors did a pretty good job. There wasn't anyone that was like noticeably really terrible. I thought the main lead did a good enough job in her role. I also want to praise the effects. There was a lot of interesting practical effects done, which I really love, and made some of the scares a little bit more effective than maybe they had any right to be. So yeah, I definitely think that there is some serious positives to take away from this movie, but I think the main thing that Felipe Vargas gives him potential to be a more interesting filmmaker down the line is that this was a truly heartfelt story, and you can tell that there was care put into the film. I think there's a lot of people that think that if you are trying to make a movie to change the world, or you think you're going to have some sort of impact on the world at all, that's just a naive perspective. But I definitely believe in the power of art, and I think someone like Hayao Miyazaki had it right. I don't remember exactly where it was, but he said that you have to believe that you're going to change the world with your movie. You have to believe it has that kind of power, and you have to put that sort of effort and love and care into it, even though it might not even make any sort of difference at all. But at the end of the day, you have to believe that you can do it, and I think that's what I like about this movie. It did feel like it believed in the power of its own art and its own storytelling, and that is very powerful, even though a lot of the execution isn't very good, and that's kind of where I kind of have struggles with this movie, because there is a lot of positives to take away, but there's also a lot of negatives that I have to get into. It's sort of constructive criticism, because I do think that Vargas has some potential here. So I think one of the major problems is that it does have like that heartfelt story that I'm talking about. It does have its belief in itself, but at the same time, clearly Vargas doesn't have the confidence to really lean into being a weird and off-the-wall horror movie. Instead, it's just a very boring, generic jump scare fest for a lot of the runtime, right? A lot of the horror moments are not particularly scary, and it just kind of gets boring after a while because nothing really has any weight. You don't really care necessarily what's happening with the jump scares, because it's just sort of quick flashes of things happening, and hands reaching out, and jump scares, and people behind you, and none of it's really that scary or effective, which is really disappointing, because the storyline is interesting, but unfortunately it just gets bogged down by this really boring, repetitive, cliched sort of horror movie that it ends up becoming, which is really disappointing. Now, that being said, I'll also say that it's just kind of a forgettable movie as well. You kind of just zone out when you're watching, and you forget what's even going on half the time. And it just also, once you get to a certain point in the movie, you think it's just going to be over, but it just keeps dragging on and on. That's another problem, is he really had trouble with pacing the story, and I think that's really became apparent towards the end of the story, as it just kept dragging on and on, as you had to pile on twist after twist, and it just wasn't that captivating after a while, and the finale is just completely stupid. So in general, I think that this film had a lot of promise, but it was bogged down too much by that jump scare fest mentality, which can be executed well. Jump scares, I can enjoy them so much in the films of James Wan and Lee Winnell. Those people are the masters of the jump scare. And so I'm not necessarily someone like a horror fan that hates jump scares and always critiques horror films that do it, or loud banging noises, because I know the effectiveness of that technique, and I know the long history of it, and I think it's a fun roller coaster kind of ride when executed well. I just think that this one relies too much on cliches and bad jump scares, doesn't necessarily understand the way that jump scares can be effective, just kind of throws them at the wall in order to have the necessities to call themselves a horror movie, when it's clear that Vargas really just wants to dive deeper into the story. I think if he had maybe taken more of a slow burn approach, like an A24 style horror movie, this maybe could have been a little bit more effective. I think that's more in line with what he wanted to do, instead of this sort of weird mess of a movie that it ends up becoming. So that's kind of my major critiques with the movie. I think there's also some problems with the writing. Like I said, it kind of leads into the pacing of the film and the plotting of it. So with that being said, though, I still do believe that Felipe Vargas does have potential. I'd love to see another horror film by him, or even just another movie in general, because I do think he has potential, and I think that there was a lot of positives that you can take away from this movie. I just think ultimately it gets weighed down too much by its generic cliches and its reliance on bad jump scares. And I think that if he understands how to execute jump scares better, this maybe would have been a much better horror film. But unfortunately, it's sort of just this mixed bag for me, that for the most part it doesn't land as a horror movie, but maybe as a drama it's a little bit better. I just think in general this is a movie that I don't want to necessarily completely tear down all the way. I want to kind of couch my criticism within a sort of positive outlook on the things that were done well, and the potential that was shown, and the care that was shown. And obviously Vargas does care. He just maybe needs to learn a little bit more, get a little bit more technical expertise and understanding of the genre before really diving into it again. I think he could make a much better horror film, and I think that this one did show that potential there. It just, like I say, gets bogged down too much and ultimately becomes a bad horror movie, or at least a mixed bag of one. So that's my ultimate thoughts for this movie, for Rosario. It's a movie I can't recommend to horror fans or really to anybody necessarily, though I do think that it's not the worst horror movie I've ever seen. It's not going to probably be the worst horror movie of 2025 or anything like that. So that's my thoughts for Rosario. If you've seen it, please let me know in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.